The distress beacon should have gone silent years ago. Instead, it pulsed through the void, a lonely, desperate rhythm, calling out from a planet where nothing should remain. A dead world. A cursed world. One that had swallowed every expedition, every probe, every desperate soul that had set foot upon its surface, and yet, somehow, the beacon still called. The Galactic Concord had long since marked Carthos 5 as a planetary tomb, unfit for colonization, unfit for study, unfit for anything but a slow, forgotten death. A world where the land itself resisted invaders, where the sky boiled with toxic storms, where structures collapsed under unseen forces, where those who landed never returned. But today, against every warning, against every whispered legend in deep space ports, a human had answered, and he wasn't just here to investigate, he was here to stay. The dropship rattled as it broke through Carthos 5's thick, storm-laden atmosphere, its hull screaming under the pressure. Automated systems fought to stabilize descent, but the onboard AI had already run the calculations. This was a one-way trip. Inside the cockpit, Captain Elias Voss sat unmoving, watching the swirling black clouds part below. He didn't flinch as the first red warning flashed across his visor. Unknown gravitational anomaly detected. He had expected this. The Concord's greatest explorers had vanished here. Entire fleets lost without a trace. Their last transmissions had been fragments of garbled distress calls, cryptic warnings about shifting landscapes, disappearing ships, voices in the wind. It wasn't war. It wasn't a plague. It wasn't anything. The Concorde could fight. It was the planet itself. And yet Elias was undeterred. He wasn't here for glory. He wasn't here for riches. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. The landing wasn't gentle. The dropship skidded across an obsidian wasteland, its hull scraping against jagged ridges of blackened rock. No vegetation, no signs of life. Only silence. Elias disengaged the safety locks and stepped forward, the airlock hissing as it opened. A dense, suffocating wind howled in greeting. The atmosphere here was breathable, barely. The air tasted metallic, as if infused with something ancient, something wrong. He took his first step onto Carthos 5. A pulse rippled beneath his boots. For the briefest moment, the ground felt like it was breathing. Elias glanced up. His visor automatically adjusted against the dim twilight. The landscape stretched endlessly, a maze of shattered terrain, twisting monoliths, and distant mountain peaks that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Then, in the distance, something moved. Not wind, not rock. Something watching. Something that knew he was here. And it was waiting. Elias took another step. The ground beneath his boots pulsed again, the sensation subtle but undeniable, as if something just beneath the surface was shifting. His HUD flickered. Anomalous readings flooded his visor, raw data translating into useless strings of numbers. The atmospheric pressure spiked erratically, and for a moment the gravity itself felt wrong. Lighter, heavier, lighter again. He exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this. Carthos 5 was no ordinary dead world. The Concorde's reports, what little, had survived the catastrophic expeditions, spoke of terrain that rearranged itself, structures that appeared and vanished, physics that refused to remain constant. But experiencing it firsthand, that was something else entirely. Elias moved carefully, each step slow, deliberate. His motion tracker remained blank, yet he felt watched. The kind of feeling that curled along the back of the neck, primal and unshakable. He had seen no wildlife, no insects, no wind-carved movement of dust or sand. Nothing, just his own shadow stretching unnaturally long across the obsidian ground. And yet, something had been there in the distance. He had seen it. Something more than shifting rock. His fingers tightened around the grip of his sidearm. A standard-issue plasma pistol, enough to drop a fully armored merc in one shot. But against whatever was out here, it felt useless. He checked his nav again. The distress beacon was still pulsing. Strange. The Concord had confirmed that all prior missions had ended in failure. The last confirmed distress signal had been logged 12 years ago, and yet the beacon Elias was tracking? It was broadcasting, at full power, like it had just been activated. The readout on his visor showed a set of coordinates half a kilometer ahead. His suit AI ran a preliminary scan, trying to map a path, only to return garbled nonsense. The readings indicated terrain that didn't exist, elevations that made no sense, structures where none had been before. Elias exhaled. "All right, Carthos," he muttered, adjusting his grip on his weapon. "Let's see what you've got." He moved forward, and behind him, the footprints he had left behind had already vanished. As Elias pressed forward, the silence deepened. The wind stopped. The air grew heavier, like he was walking through something unseen. Then, a sound. A low, wet whisper. Close. Too close, and... It came from directly behind him. Elias froze. The whisper hadn't come from the wind. There was no wind. His breath slowed, his grip tightening around his pistol. The sound had been close, too close, and worse, it had sounded like him. Not an exact match, not quite an echo, but off. Like a voice remembering how to form itself. "Let's see what you've got." The words he had spoken moments ago twisted into something wrong. He turned slowly, his visor enhancing the gloom, scanning the shifting terrain. There was nothing there, at least, nothing he could see. His suit's audio filters kicked in, scanning for anomalous frequencies. The readout pulsed erratically, unable to isolate a source. The sound hadn't been environmental, it had been intentional. Then, another sound. Crunch. A footstep. Directly behind him, Elias pivoted fast, gun raised. Nothing. The terrain stretched empty in all directions, twisted rock formations jutting into a sky that seemed darker than before. He took a step back. Crunch. Another step. Not. The hairs on his arms stood on end. His body knew before his mind could rationalize it. Something was here. Something was watching, and worse. Something was learning. His HUD flickered again, scrambling as he took another step. The readout began overlaying old terrain data on top of new. For a split second, two different versions of Carthos 5 existed at once. One real, one an imitation. Then, just as suddenly, the interference vanished. Elias exhaled, forcing his pulse to slow. He had encountered anomalies before. Rogue AI, gravity wells, even a living asteroid that had tried to swallow his ship whole. But this? This was different. The planet itself wasn't just shifting, it was reacting. His visor auto-logged another scan as he stepped toward the distress beacon's coordinates. The terrain seemed solid beneath his boots until it wasn't. For a split second, the ground shimmered beneath him, mirroring his reflection. Not rock, not soil, but a distorted copy of himself. His own silhouette, a second too slow, lagging behind his movements. Elias took another step. The reflection twitched. Its head snapped up and it smiled. Not with his mouth, but with too many teeth. The ground collapsed beneath him, not natural erosion, not a cave-in. Something opened. Something wanted him to fall. And Elias had just stepped straight into its trap. Elias barely had time to react. The ground wasn't crumbling, it was unraveling. A perfect circle of void opened beneath him, swallowing rock, dust, and light into a space that shouldn't exist. No seismic tremor. No warning, just a silent, deliberate act of devouring. His reflexes kicked in, legs tensing, arms reaching, but there was nothing to grab. He fell. The abyss rushed up to meet him. For a few seconds, there was only darkness. Then, light, not from above, from below. The world tilted. Gravity twisted, his body snapping sideways before his boots slammed onto something solid. Elias gasped, lungs struggling against a sudden shift in pressure. He had stopped falling. But he hadn't landed. He was standing on the wall of the abyss. Or rather, what should have been the wall. The hole he had fallen into was no longer above him. It was beside him. The terrain had reassembled itself mid-fall. His mind fought to make sense of it. The space around him was shifting, folding in on itself as if the planet was rewriting its own rules. And then, the footsteps returned. Not echoes, not tricks of sound. Something else had fallen with him, and it was getting closer. Elias turned, weapon raised. Through the dim, a figure emerged. It walked like him. It moved like him. But the way it watched, the way it studied him, was something else entirely. The suit was the same, the stance, even the damaged HUD flicker across its visor. But then it smiled, not an expression, not an attempt to communicate. A test. Elias's stomach dropped. It wasn't just mimicking him. It was practicing. Then it spoke. His own voice. Flat. Hollow. Let's see what you've got. The exact words he had said before stepping forward. Not a recording. Not an echo. It had learned. And it was perfecting him. Elias had fought mercenaries, pirates, even alien predators that hunted through scent and sound. But he had never fought himself. Not like this. And as he raised his weapon, his duplicate did the same. One of them was real. One of them was Carthos 5's creation, and neither could afford to be wrong. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired first. A searing bolt of plasma shot forward, only for his doppelgänger to move before the trigger was even pulled. Not a dodge, not reflex, anticipation. The plasma scorched past, hitting nothing but air. The duplicate tilted its head, studying him. Then it raised its own weapon, identical in every way, and fired back. Elias barely twisted aside, the shot grazing his shoulder. Heat flared through his suit, alarms blinking red, but he ignored them. He had fought in a dozen battlefields, survived things that should have killed him. But this wasn't a battle. This was a test, and the thing across from him was learning. The terrain shifted beneath his feet. The ground was not stable, not fixed. The walls of the abyss pulsed like muscle, rearranging with every move. Carthos 5 wasn't just mimicking him, it was adapting. Elias's duplicate stepped forward, and for the first time, he saw its eyes. Not his own, not even close. They were too deep, too black, too endless. Like the planet itself was watching through them. You are not the first. The voice came from nowhere, everywhere. You will not be the last. The duplicate rushed him. Elias fired again. 3 rapid shots, only for the copy to move perfectly in, sync, his own stance, his own reflexes, his own aggression. He pivoted, dodging a return blast, but the thing's movements were already adjusting, learning, improving. The next shot it fired came a fraction faster than his own. Elias barely avoided. His mind raced. He had fought elite soldiers, alien war beasts, AI-driven assassins, but never something that learned as it fought. If he kept reacting, he would lose. He had to break the pattern. Elias did the only thing his copy couldn't predict. He lowered his weapon, stopped moving, stopped resisting. The duplicate hesitated. Fraction of a second, barely there, but Elias saw it. A gap. The creature expected resistance, expected the fight. Elias gave it nothing, and then he moved, not with speed, not with brute force, but with something the duplicate did not have. Instinct. He twisted into its space, slamming an armored elbow into its visor. The thing staggered, the first time it had been off balance. Elias pressed the attack, not with technique, not with precision, but with chaos, unpredictable, messy, human. The duplicate shuddered, its form flickered. For the first time, it failed. To keep up, the planet had copied him, but it could only copy what it understood, and humans were not meant to be understood. Elias drove his fist forward. The thing's body gave way like dust. A ripple of something ancient, something vast, something aware moved through the air. Then, the abyss collapsed. Light, noise, a sensation like falling upward. And then, Silence. Elias woke to an empty sky. The rift was gone. The terrain was still. But as he stood, his visor flickered, and in the reflection of his cracked HUD, he wasn't alone. Elias stood still, his breathing ragged, heart pounding against his ribs. The thing, his copy, his echo, his predator, was gone. At least that's what he told himself. Yet the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was waiting. The ground beneath him remained steady. The air still carried that metallic taste, thick and unnatural. The world no longer twisted beneath his feet, no longer rearranged itself with each step. For the first time since landing, Carthos 5 was still, and that terrified him more than anything. His fingers flexed against the hilt of his plasma knife, still slick with whatever passed for the doppelgänger's blood. He flicked the weapon off and sheathed it, but the unease remained. His thoughts itched, nagging at the edges of certainty. He remembered killing it. He remembered the fight. But if the planet could mimic his every move, his every instinct, how could he be sure it hadn't already replaced him? Elias clenched his jaw, pushing the thought aside. There was no time for paranoia. Not now. The beacon still pulsed, and whatever waited at its source, it had been waiting for him. He turned toward the distress signal's coordinates, instinctively checking behind him. His stomach turned. There were no footprints. Not his, not anyone's. The terrain behind him was untouched, undisturbed, like he had never walked this way at all. His skin went cold. Had he even moved? Had he even been here at all? Or had Carthos 5 been walking through him? Ahead, the beacon's glow cut through the murk, like an eye staring back at him. He could leave. He could turn back, retreat to his drop pod, attempt an emergency launch. But would it be him leaving? Or had the planet already rewritten him, one thought at a time? The beacon pulsed again, a rhythm, a summons. Elias took a breath, forcing his hands, steady. There was only one way to know the truth. He stepped forward, and the world followed.